Before we get into the scientific revolution, I just want to make one broad comment that might be obvious if you've watched previous videos in this series. For most of human history, people did not expect to live healthier or more prosperous lives than previous generations. Sometimes life got better, and sometimes it got worse. It's true that human populations were increasing and that life expectancy was increasing gradually, but the idea that it is normal for human life to get better over time is very new. Today, most European countries have high life expectancy, low maternal mortality, and low rates of absolute poverty. But there have been about 10,000 generations of humans, and we are perhaps the 10th generation who could reliably expect disease burden and child mortality and poverty to steadily decrease in our lifetimes. Well, I'm part of the 10th, you're probably part of the 11th, but regardless, we owe much of this change to the scientific revolution. So like the Reformation, the scientific revolution was another break with religious teachings. The Catholic Church taught that the Earth was the center of the universe and had been so since the creation. The sun, moon, and planets traveled around the Earth in perfectly circular orbits like the rings of an onion. And beyond the onion was the realm of the divine, whose light pierced through in the form of stars. All this perfect motion was the work of God himself, and any other understanding of the universe was therefore a challenge to God's eternal perfection as described in the scriptures. But like good Renaissance people, the new astronomers and mathematicians and their colleagues in other fields declared that these old theories needed to be re-examined. The first problem was that the perfect orbits of the planets and moon and sun did not fit with observation, causing astronomers to resort to ancient Ptolemaic explanations, basically that the planets followed their own circular paths, which also revolved around the Earth. Anyway, just before his death in 1543, Polish-born Nicholas Copernicus, a well-connected doctor of canon law and a researcher in mathematics and astronomy and classical literature, published On the Revolution of the Celestial Spheres. He noted problems with classical astronomical theory and determined that the universe was heliocentric, that is, the sun rather than the Earth was at the center. The Catholic Church's reaction to this was negative. The Italian monk Giordano Bruno, for instance, was burned at the stake in 1600 for teaching Copernicus's heliocentric findings. Let's go to the thought bubble. By this time, the observations of Galileo Galilei were bringing matters to a head. Galileo was obsessed with science, especially its mathematical features and the calculations at the base of Copernicus's heliocentric theory. Galileo's father had wanted him to become a doctor, but mathematics drew him in. It's the oldest story in the world. He invented many tools like an early thermometer and his own telescope, which he used to dramatically improve human understanding of the universe. He was the first person to observe the moons of Jupiter and the first to understand that the Milky Way was a collection of stars. The telescope also showed irregular spots on the sun, a further sign of heavenly imperfections that went against the beliefs espoused by the Catholic Church. Despite Galileo's prestige as a mathematician, his work on the nature of the universe went too far for the Church. In 1615, Galileo went to Rome to teach the clergy about the heliocentric universe and convince them of its accuracy. In 1616, it was condemned as heretical, and Galileo promised not to teach that the Earth moved. But in 1632, he published Dialogue Concerning the Two Chief World Systems, in which he described the Ptolemaic system, on which the Church based its Earth-centered astronomical teachings, and the Copernican system. In 1636, the Roman Inquisition found him guilty of heresy and forced him to recant in order to avoid execution, and so Galileo recanted. In 1992, after a 13-year investigation, the Catholic Church finally publicly acknowledged that the judgment against him had been wrong. Any revolution needs good propagandists, and people were advertising that the new scientific values and practices were amazing, while also pointing out that the ancient and traditional ones were full of errors. English politician Francis Bacon was foremost among these science propagandists, chiding everyone who was using the old paradigms and models of the universe, calling them worthless ancients. Bacon, like others at the time, created his own careful observations and experiments and sought to use reason. There was, he said, a scientific method to be followed. One needn't rely on past accounts that were copies of copies of copies. One should ask their own questions and do their own experiments to find the answer to those questions, experiments that other people could then replicate to confirm or refute the findings. And this became the basis for the new scientific method as Bacon laid it out in The Advancement of Learning. His process of reaching the truth and drawing conclusions from specific, reliable facts or evidence is called inductive reasoning. Let's reflect on the ways in which so-called new scientists during the 16th and 17th centuries bravely took religious scriptures out of the workings of astronomy and the heavens. Instead of a divine hand at work, by the time of Newton, universal laws for the operation of the solar system and physical bodies had been established. And although most people believed in God, many of them earnestly so, they also followed a developing scientific method and additionally established faith in their own rational powers. This way of looking at the world would prove so important that less than 350 years after Galileo became the first person to observe the moon's cratered surface, human beings would step foot on that surface.